Good evening and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Ndengendenge. Next week is International Women's Day under the theme #ChooseToChallenge, and tonight we are choosing to challenge rape myths. Now, rape myths are stories or beliefs around rape that are false and not true. And unfortunately, one of these myths emerged recently during a speech by our Education Minister, Angie Motshekga, when she spoke to pupils at a high school in Pretoria and said, educated men do not rape. Now, I don't have to tell you how problematic that statement is, or that rapists come in all forms, shapes and sizes, suburbs, institutions, with degrees, without degrees. One thing we know for sure, rape does not discriminate, or does it? In 2017, the Medical Research Council released a report called Rape Justice South Africa, where it looked at how many rape cases end in conviction, how many don't, and why. One of the findings was that rape myths actively contribute to whether a case goes to trial or not, or whether it ends in a conviction or not. Now, after the break, we are going to be speaking to a range of guests about rape myths, how it contributes to rape culture, and how it negatively affects the justice process for survivors. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short clip from a previous show where survivors discuss the myth of real rape. Let's have a look. Welcome back. You're watching the Womxn Show, and today we're having a survivor roundtable. And ladies, I want to come back into the conversation just with a clip from Lynn's previous show that we had, where she talks about the response from police officers referring to her rape as a real rape. And let's just have a look at that quickly.
In that process, my parents were called, and I'll never forget, in fact, preparing for the show, the one thing that I didn't put in my book that just came through while in prep mode for the show was walking into the police station, the one police saying, "My God, was she in a train accident?" And the other one looking at him and looking at me with tears in his eyes saying, "This is a real rape."
Now we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we're speaking about rape myths, which are false beliefs about rape that affect how people define rape, whether victims choose to report the rape or not, and how survivors are treated in the justice system if they do report. Now, joining me now is Dimitri Liountris, who recently published a research paper on rape myths in the medical community and whether this affects the level of care that survivors receive. Dimitri, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Dimitri, you've done a paper on rape myths in sort of the medical sector, looking at whether GPs or general practitioners hold any rape myths that affect, their services to survivors of rape and sexual assault. But your paper starts with very interesting definitions of rape myths and, false beliefs in general. So I was hoping that you could just take us through that, because often people aren't aware that they hold false beliefs. So what are they?
So I suppose we should start with so rape myths are basically they're beliefs that society or people hold about sexual assault that just aren't true, but they're so common and they seem to come from a place of what people would call logical, that people just think they're true, but they're not. The definitions I use, the first one, it's defined as prejudicial stereotype, false beliefs about rape victims and rapists. It came from a woman named Martha Burt, who in the 1980s wanted to see if people had acceptance of rape myths, what level they had. So she published the first full study on that. So basically, it's like, for example, some rape myths are things like husband can't rape their wife. which is just, by legal definition, that's just insane. It's illogical, and yet it's a very held belief. It's not just wife or husbands, it's also in couples, which is why things like date rape are such contentious issues. So that's basically what rape myths are. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, no, it did. And I mean, I think as a woman, I can think of a few more. And I actually said in the introduction that we're looking at, rape myths contribute in ways even, I sort of say, before a rape happens. It's the short skirt sort of rape myth that says a girl wearing a short skirt is loose and perhaps asking for it, or, drinking.
Yes, 100%. Rape myths actually they've been split into, in academia, rape myths have actually been split into certain sections. And like one of the biggest sections are things like she asked for it, or she lied about it. And it links to things like she wore a skirt, or she regretted having sex with the man, so now she's claiming rape. Things like that. There's even myths that delegitimize rape. Explicitly say, no, it wasn't rape. If they were both drunk, it wasn't rape. So those are some examples. They're very common things. You probably hear them all the time. You probably hear them in TV all the time, or in news articles. They're very pervasive in society.
And I think, actually, I'm going to add to that, because I think as I was researching it, we've probably even said them ourselves. I mean, if you think back to sort of school days and the beliefs that we've had, and I think the things that we see on TV and how we've been socialized to think about women and men and gender and sex, as I'm reading through the rape myths, I'm seeing a lot of things that I may have even as a joke subscribed to once upon a time. But moving in, with us speaking about that, and with you speaking about sort of a judge's comments on that, how do rape myths contribute to secondary trauma for survivors? I mean, did you come across any of that in your research?
So it comes across, I suppose you can split into two ways, procedurally and psychologically. Psychologically, it is re-victimization, because so what people need to understand about rape, it is the physical act, and that is terrible, but there's also a lot of psychological damage to the victim as well. And just the secondary victimization of not being believed, of being questioned, of having the blame put on you, which a lot of time happens. It leads to things like depression, anxiety, mistrust of people, because if you come forward and nothing happens, you don't really want to come forward anymore. So you've got the psychological thing, but what we focused on more was what I found more was procedural stuff, in that it actually affects how the investigation goes forward. If you have police officers who subscribe to rape myths, who think if alcohol was involved as a mitigating factor, or the way the woman is dressed, she was asking for it, it could affect how they investigate the crime. And the problem is these things sort of compound, they come onto each other, because if the prosecutor subscribes to rape myths, they may not even think about prosecuting. Or because rape myths are so prevalent, even if the prosecutor doesn't, but they see things like alcohol was involved, or drugs, or it was a prior relationship, stuff like that, they might not want to take it to court because they think they can't win. So it affects the actual procedure of getting justice for victims, which, in my opinion, only circulates rape myths back into the narrative of society, because the victim has a rape, no one believes her, or they do believe her, but rape myths that, delegitimize the crime, there's no justice. People think that, oh, well, her case wasn't strong enough, or she was lying, or something like that happened.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I think that a lot of alleged perpetrators, I should say, so in cases I've seen where it's been dropped, where a rape charge has been dropped, or it's not been prosecuted, and we've seen this actually recently with the DJ Euphonic saga, where that charge was dropped, and immediately a statement was put out that means it was not true. Whereas the charge being dropped doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that, you know, the evidence possibly was not strong enough or a host of other reasons.
Yes, 100%. It just means that there wasn't strength in the case going into court, or there wasn't enough there. It doesn't actually mean the charge wasn't true. I mean, you could go from the other side and say there was a charge, so they had something that suggested it had happened. But no one ever looks at it that way. So yes, it is a reinforcing thing when these cases get dropped. And the problem with that is that sometimes it's the rape myth that causes these cases to be so contentious in the first place, and then they get dropped, and it's just a circle. It's just a cycle that carries on. Which actually, now that we mentioned that, I forgot to mention the other effect of rape myths is sometimes survivors don't come forward. There are numerous studies I found that I went through that there were some victims who, even by the legal definition of rape, especially the legal definition we have in South Africa, which is quite broad, it was legally rape, and yet they didn't know what had happened to them would be classified as rape or sexual assault because it didn't fit into the narrow view of what we consider. It's a term called real rape, which I think I'll explain a bit later, but it's basically it's the view of how, it's the most common view of how people think rape occurs, which isn't actually true. Maybe I should just describe what real rape is now, just to...
Yes, I was gonna say, we might as well move into real rape. And I think what's interesting about the rape myth of real rape, and looking at the fact that you interviewed or you did your research within the, I think that within the medical sector, real rape is often associated with additional physical injuries.
Yes.
So maybe you can take us through that.
Okay, so, sorry. Basically, real rape is, I don't know how to put this without it sounding weird, because it is going to sound weird. It's basically what the typical rape looks like to a typical person, in that if you had to ask someone to describe a rape, this is probably what they bring up. Sorry about that. The problem is that it's not actually true. So real rape, and it's always, whenever it's discussed, it's always in inverted commas. Basically what it is, it subscribes to like 4 basic components that all sort of turn out to be rape myths. So in order for something to be a real rape, or what people consider more likely to be a rape in which you have no blame on the victim and all the blame on the perpetrator, is that the 4 things are: it was committed by a stranger, it was outdoors, the victim put up heavy resistance or some form of resistance at least, and there was violence or the threat of violence. If you describe that to someone, they will 100% tell you that was a rape. The problem is those 4 things don't always happen. In fact, they rarely happen. Most people know their rapist or know their sexual assaulter. It's not always outdoor because you know the sexual assaulter, the offender. It's not always violent in how we... So that's the problem with the violence. Violence is actually part of something that needs to be unpacked. The way we as society in general talk about violence, there's always blood or gore or bruises or everything. That's not necessarily the case when it comes to rape. She may not have been beaten or stabbed or anything, the victim rather, not just she. But it's possible that the rape still occurred. And then finally, the resistance. If someone bigger than you, if someone is threatening you, if someone's pressuring you, you might not resist. And like I said, going back to the initial thing I was saying before, some people don't know that what's happened to them is rape because it wasn't by a stranger. It wasn't outdoors. It wasn't this typical thing we see on TV or in stories that like horrify us. And that's the issue. And that's what real rape is. And that's one of the issues. And to go back to my other point on how it affects cases, if a woman sees that concept of real rape, that it was a stranger, that she had to resist, that it was outdoors, that there was a weapon involved, and none of that happened to her, but she was still raped, she might not come forward. Not because she's scared, but because she actually doesn't understand what happened to her was sexual assault. She still has all the psychological effects that come from it. She still has the post-traumatic stress, but because society has said this actually isn't rape, it's something else, it's probably assault or something, she won't come forward with it.
Yes, now I have actually come across many cases where that has actually happened, and I think, especially, the incidences like that often, I guess we typically call them date rape, acquaintance rape. But in many cases where women were raped sort of while they were out on a date, those are largely the cases that are not reported because they automatically sort of, one, they believe that no one will believe them, and two, they believe that they were complicit in some way, just by nature of going willingly with that person. And so we read a lot about that type of narrative, and you've mentioned it earlier, where the person themselves don't really even, classify it as rape. They just know that it's a violation of some sort.
Yes, 100%. Because there's also, especially in dates, there's this notion of social exchange. So especially in dates where he pays for the date and he picked her up and he took her out, it's this feeling of that, oh, well, he deserves some sort of payment, if you want to call it that. And which isn't true. Like, he doesn't. Or, like, she doesn't. Like, the other person doesn't deserve sexual favors from you just because they took you on a date. But because we have that mindset, and because it wasn't violent and all of that, a lot of women do think to themselves, oh, well, maybe this was just something that happened. Maybe it was just me over-exaggerating. Maybe it wasn't that bad, which is a problem. It's a big problem.
So, Dimitri, I just want to ask you about, why did you decide to look into rape myths and within the medical community? And what were some of your findings? Was any of it really interesting?
Okay, so why I decided to look at rape myths was, so those are two different questions about why I looked at medical community and rape myths. So rape myths, I looked into it because I just found it fascinating, the concept of how we, I don't know what the word is, how we conceptualize rape as a society. My thinking, from a bit of naivety, I was reading, it was actually my honors year, like 5 years ago now. I was reading a paper on rape myths, and the thing that shocked me was how many women in the paper subscribed to these rape myths. I just found that so odd because I thought women would push back against it more. Maybe that was me being a bit naive, but that's what got me interested in it, just the psychology of it, of how we understand this violation of a crime. In terms of the medical community, I found a lot of studies that focus on demographics, gender, age, not so much on race, but like on occupation. And the occupation thing really caught me because I felt that was more important to understand how police officers, lawyers, judges, doctors, nurses, how they interact with rape victims, because those are the people who interact with victims of sexual assault. Those are the ones who would probably cause the most damage if they believe it's myths. The reason why we focus specifically on medical practitioners, though, is because there's such a high rate of rape in South Africa, and because many victims don't come forward because they don't want to press charges or anything because they're afraid they might not be believed. They don't know what happened to them was rape, what we've discussed. They still might need medical care. And we wanted to know if private general practitioners subscribed to these myths. If a victim walked into their office, would they feel welcome or would they feel that they're being re-victimized again? In terms of findings, they were, in terms of the rape myths findings, they were encouraging. Doctors had very low levels of rape myths acceptance. The highest mark was 1 point over halfway of what the total score was. So the way it worked, we used this scale, and it gave you a score up to 110, and the closer you were to 110, the more likely you were to believe in rape myths. The highest score was 56, so it was 1 point over halfway. So my sample at least had very low levels of rape myth acceptance, so that was quite encouraging. Something that wasn't encouraging was that even though there were low levels of rape myth acceptance, and even though doctors were more likely to want to learn how to treat sexual assault victims better, they felt they didn't actually have the knowledge to do it, the knowledge of the law, of what to fill in, of where to actually take rape victims to the hospital, to the police, things like that. So that was quite discouraging.
That does sound discouraging. But can I ask, Dimitri, did you find that GPs do they see a lot of rape victims or survivors? That's actually, I'm interested now because I wouldn't generally think that someone would go to GP unless perhaps they hadn't reported officially and they decided to sort of take care of it themselves.
Yes, unfortunately, a little bit of regret I have is that I didn't ask how many victims of sexual assault these GPs have seen, but one of the questions we did ask was, have you ever assisted a victim of sexual assault? And it was quite a high number. I think it was in the 80% of people who have. So they're definitely getting victims of sexual assault coming to their office, which was also surprisingly fun for us because we also thought maybe they'd go to casualty at hospital, or maybe they'd go to the police, straight to the police. Yeah. But again, because the crime is it's such a contentious thing to bring forward, and it's such a scary thing to talk about, that maybe you just want to go get yourself checked just to make sure you're okay. Yeah. And if you don't want that to be out in the open, you're probably going to go to your private GP. And so that's why we went there. And well, clearly the results show that the majority of these people, of the doctors, had dealt with victims. The ones who didn't were people who had only 5 or less years experience. So they weren't in the field for a long time anyway, which might account for why they didn't have any victims of sexual assault come to them yet. But it might happen. Like I said, I would have preferred to actually ask how many victims if they remembered, but unfortunately it was a question we just missed.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very encouraging actually to hear that survivors are going to GPs, that GPs are treating them, in whichever context they're being approached. Dimitri, that's all the time we have for this interview, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and for sharing the insights with us and about your study and especially about explaining rape myths.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And thank you. This is actually a really important topic and show. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Dimitri Liountris, who recently published a research paper on rape myths. After the break, we'll be speaking to Rape Crisis. But for now, we're going to take a short break and we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we're speaking about rape myths or false beliefs around rape. Before the break, we spoke to Dimitri Liountris, who published a research paper on rape myths, and now we are joined by Rifqah Barnes, who is the Training and Development Coordinator at Rape Crisis, and we're going to look at how rape myths are perpetuated, not just within the justice system, but also within our communities, also, looking at ourselves as holders of rape myths. Rifqah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
So, Rifqah, tonight we are speaking about rape myths, which are false beliefs. And we've had a guest on earlier that was speaking about, how these really are things about rape that people believe, but that are not necessarily true.
Yes.
And I had also said that, these rape myths, they often start outside of and before sort of even a rape occurs, in the way that, we know people say things, they see a young girl, she's wearing her school skirt is really short, or women are going to a party and they've been drinking, and we know that all of these things sort of feed into whether the belief about whether a rape was valid. I mean, I hate using those terms, but whether they believe the rape was real or not. And so I wanted to ask, working at Rape Crisis, can you tell us about some ways that rape myths contribute to rape culture?
Absolutely. I mean, as you were saying, you spoke to the guest before this, and there are so many examples because, a rape, if I should start off, and this is always where I like to start off with understanding what rape is, and there is a legal definition for this, and it really speaks to someone being forced into a sexual penetrative act that they haven't consented or agreed to. And so, if we look at the legal definition of rape, a lot of the times people will question, they will question, well, she was at a party, so maybe she was looking at for it, or she was drunk. Why does she put herself in these kinds of situations? And so these rape myths are very, very harmful. It leads people to blame the survivor, to blame the woman, who and it puts the responsibility, on the survivor, because she has an idea of what her parents might think, what her social groups might think, what her community at large, how they see rape, and a lot of the times this creates doubt in the victim, and she starts questioning and blaming herself and feeling guilty. But at the end of the day, we should remember that just because you were at that party, you didn't ask you, why do we go to a party? We go because we want to have fun. We, when there's music, we dance, you hang out, you chill with your friends, people play, games. Those are the reasons why people go to a party, not to be raped or to be forced into something that they don't want to participate in. A lot of the times, when we engage with our youth at tertiary institutions or even out of school youth in our communities, a lot of the times the question around survivors would take our facilitators aside and would say, but I was drunk when he forced me.
Mm.
And the one thing that we need to remember is that being drunk is not a crime,
Mm.
but forcing somebody to do something, especially to engage in a sexual act that he or she did not agree to, that is where the crime comes in. Going to the party, there's nothing wrong with going to a party. It's not illegal to go to a party. It's not illegal to have fun either. But the mere fact that this person had already made up his mind or her mind in, this is what I want from this person and I'm gonna take it.
Mm.
Whichever way or form, that is the crime. So a lot of the times in society we also see what happens on social media. We are exposed to so much, not only the news, but yes, in our social circles. But when we also read and we know about the low conviction rates,
Mm.
that also makes our survivors despondent to even report the rape or even tell someone about the rape, because they feel that the criminal justice system has failed so many other survivors. Um, the National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, they reported that as low as 7% of all reported cases goes to trial, and actually a conviction or a sentencing happens at the end of that trial. So when we look at that number of 7%, people, women, survivors, they tend to lose hope in the criminal justice system.
Mm.
And so it also, um, and now I'm moving on to speaking about the criminal justice system, but these rape myths and these false beliefs, as we say, um, it contributes to people being silent. It contributes to people not reporting and going out and seeking the necessary medical care. So, because we are also worried or we think about, um, what is the nurse? How is the nurse going to treat me at the hospital? Um, how is the police even going to believe me because I was at the party,
Mm.
And or are they going to judge me because I was at the party and it's already 3, 4 o'clock in the morning? Are they gonna, these kinds of thoughts goes through the survivor's mind, and these are just examples that I can use of what many years ago when I was I'm more in the training and development department right now. But years ago when I was sitting with clients face to face, when I was a counselor, these are the kinds of questions that goes through my clients' minds. You know, what would my parents think? I'm going to bring shame on the family.
And so, Rifqah, if I can interject, it's interesting that you say that, because what I'm thinking about is that, so this rape has occurred, a rape has occurred, but for what it adds is almost it adds these other levels of justification sort of on top of it. So I know, and I'll give an example. I was assaulted, and you know, with thank you. I mean, I was a young teenager, and it's funny to say I was lucky, but mine fell within the sort of gambit of stranger rape, and so it was more believable. But for many years after that, it had been a man that knocked at the door, and I opened that door to a stranger, and I was 15 years old already, you know. But for many years, I sat with guilt because I was like, why did I open that door? And so as I speak to more and more survivors, what pushes through really is the fear of judgment for what precedes the rape, for the decisions that are made, for what, as you were saying, going to the party, having a drink, all of these things that are not crimes. And I wanted to bring up something our previous guest said. He said he started the research because he read something very interesting about how many women hold beliefs about rape myths, and that in fact a lot of those beliefs that they hold themselves leads to them not reporting. And did you find that, I mean, as a counselor, and do you see that coming through the organization?
Absolutely, all the time. Community, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done in our community to make people debunk these myths and to make them understand that it is not your fault. The mere innocent of just opening the door, what could have happened, you know? And sometimes, and it's true when you say that you go through a lot of different things. Why didn't I? If I did not open the door, this wouldn't have happened. What was your intention in opening the door? It could have been a family member. It could have been someone needing a slice of bread. But we don't think that. We're rather thinking, oh, well, why is she opening the door in the middle? You know, people, people try and think of other reasons, and that contributes to the survivor being even more silenced because it's such a negative mindset that needs to be shifted, because they're not focusing on the thing that was a crime, that is wrong. Why was that person and we don't question what was that person doing at your door?
Yeah.
You know, what was that person doing there? Rather, we focus on ourselves because we feel we could have controlled. And this is where it comes in. We feel we could have controlled the situation. But at the end of the day, when we look at it, we need to understand that rape is about power. That perpetrator intentionally knew that he or she is going to come and overpower whoever's going to open that door. And I'm sorry that I'm using this example again because we brought it up.
Yes.
But and you know, these myths that people believe and these questions that people continuously ask, it feeds that myth, and it makes people believe that we can prevent a rape, which is not true. There is no way that people can prevent, and I know that this sounds harsh, and you know, we try and say things as sensitively as possible because this is a very sensitive topic. But myths make us believe that we can prevent rape. Why did we walk that way? Why didn't we choose another path?
why did I choose to go to that um, party? Why did I choose to go to that university, for example? If if a rape, happened at a particular place. But your intention is not to get raped at the end of the day. Your intention was to go get an education, to go have a good time. Um, so what we also need to understand is that it shifts our focus from addressing the real problem. And for example, people's attitudes towards violence, and that's also another topic. People's attitudes towards violence, this woman, the whole violence story is very, it's also a very broad topic, but it's necessary to have because people need to also understand that women are vulnerable in these situations, and we don't ask to be right. We don't do things deliberately because, oh, I'm gonna wear this or this skirt today, and maybe someone will just do it for me, or if you know what I'm trying to say.
No, I do. And what's interesting is that, let's say, I mean, obvious, I'm not promoting any myths again about gender, but let's say you dress yourself, I'm not even going to say in a short skirt. If you dress yourself in an attractive way because you want to feel attractive for yourself and whatever that looks like, you probably pass around 50 men who don't rape you. You know what I mean? In the street, as you're walking, if you're taking a taxi, you're driving, you're at work, wherever you are. And I mean, I loved your perspective earlier that said, rape myths make us believe that we could have prevented it, that we had some sort of control, but we didn't. The only person that was controlling the situation was obviously a perpetrator. And I watched a TED Talk the other day that actually, where the survivor had said the only person that could have prevented my rape was the rapist. And so it's a really good perspective to have. And I mean, I feel like I've learned something, so thank you for that.
And can I just make a point on the clothing? Woman and anyone has the right to wear what makes them feel comfortable. If you need to wear something to make you feel beautiful, then that is your right as a South African citizen. We all have the right to choose. And when people want to use the reason for, oh, well, a school skirt, why does she make a school skirt so short? Or why does she always wear, why is she, wearing revealing clothing in whatever situation, whether it be in a public space or whether it be going to a function or whatever. But then we need to think of, what about the young child? What about the baby that is wearing a grower? What about those survivors? What about those victims? What about the older person that has long dresses? What about women who look like the way in which I look, where I have my scarf on, I'm fully clothed, and we even have women that wears the niqab, which is like a parda, which is another word for it, where they close this half of their face. What about those women?
So, Rifqah, can I?
Into officers and are survivors.
Yes.
They have all been, women from all walks of life or raped and sexually abused.
So, Rifqah, and you make such a good point. And so from there, I just want to shift then the rape myth sort of story over to perpetrators, because the other side of that, when you're speaking about, what about, women from all walks of life, obviously we're looking at the fact that perpetrators rape women from all walks of life. And so that is where the accountability should lie. There is a myth that men cannot control themselves. So here we're going into opposites.
Yes. I've been fortunate enough to have many males in our engagements, whether it be at some of our UCT lectures with some medical students in the past, quite a bit of males there, and we speak a lot about myths in those sessions. I've also had engagements in community workshops where men sit in my workshop, and these are the kinds of myths that, especially if we have males, um, or people identifying as males, especially them, we take advantage and we ask the question. We say, so can males control themselves, if sexually aroused? Because the myth goes that men cannot control themselves, as you have mentioned, and 100%, okay, 99% of the time, actually, and I'll tell you about the 1% now, or rather maybe 0.1%. But majority of the times, men confidently say, yes, they can control themselves. There was one situation where I was just, trying not to, I was just trying to be technical, in where this one person had said, no, they can't control themselves. And it was a bit of a debate, and I think he misunderstood the question, because under certain circumstances, he then realized he wouldn't want to force, himself on someone, especially if he's not in a relationship. But I can tell you, majority of the time, men admit, and I think that 0.1%, if I should say, you was maybe just trying to be a bit difficult, because we're also not sure if he was a perpetrator himself, sitting in the workshop, and trying to maybe have an excuse for whatever he has done. Going to all of the men that, realize that they need to take this topic seriously. We as humanity, we as human beings need to stand together, males and females. But the males in our society understand and recognize the seriousness of the situation. And they tell the truth, and they say that we can control ourselves. Because once we see a resistance from a woman, that respect is there. And there was one example where a male student was saying that is what differentiates us from animals, where we have a choice. We can make a choice. Yeah. We can say yes and we can say no, and we can think about what we are doing or what we're going to be engaging in, and making a decision based on that.
That was Rifqah Barnes from Rape Crisis. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about rape myths. Now, before the break, we spoke to Rifqah Barnes, who was the Training and Development Coordinator at Rape Crisis. We're just going to go back to Rifqah for a last message to survivors of rape, to communities who have to deal with survivors, and to all the practitioners. Rifqah, can you give us a last few words of encouragement around rape myths?
The first main thing that I want to say is, if someone comes to you and they say that they have been raped or sexually abused, believe them. Please believe them. Encourage them and support them. We have a lot of there's a lot of help out there. Rape Crisis. I'm sure you guys will give our contact details.
Yes.
There are Gaqazele care centers also, where there are one-stop rape centers. That information I can also share with Cape Town TV, and hopefully they'll be able to post those emergency numbers and those facilities where you can get help. Supporting someone is probably one of the most important things that we can do. I encourage survivors, if you are 18 years and older, you are not forced go and report your rape, but there are places where you can collect legal evidence, and we are here to support you when you are ready to report the rape, because your health is the most important thing.
Okay,
To
thank
get
you,
the
Rifqah. I'm so
would be
sorry to
great.
cut, but thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for the interview and for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
And that brings us to the end of our show. If you or someone you know has been affected by rape or sexual assault, you can reach out to Rape Crisis by calling the number on the screen. And in the words of Rifqah Barnes from Rape Crisis, if someone tells you they've been sexually assaulted or raped, your first step is to believe them. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mlondleni. Good night.